A virgin's tears, trapped in an arranged marriage with a millionaire. Welcome to Alcot Stories, where love, betrayal, and deep emotions come to life. If you believe in the power of love, if you enjoy heart-touching stories that make you feel every emotion, then you're in the right place. Here, we bring you stories filled with passion, heartbreak, and unforgettable endings that will leave you in tears. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Alcott Stories so you never miss a single heartwarming tale, and hit that notification bell to stay updated on our latest uploads. Let's dive into a world of love together. Your next favorite story starts now. Aaliyah sat in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. Her large, expressive eyes shimmered under the golden lights, but there was no joy in them. The wedding dress she wore was breathtaking, a masterpiece of silk and lace, adorned with tiny pearls that shimmered like stars. Yet, despite the beauty of it all, she felt suffocated. She had always dreamed of a wedding filled with love, a union where two souls intertwined with passion and understanding. Instead, she was being married off like a transaction. Her parents, loving but bound by tradition, had arranged this marriage for her, and the man she was about to call her husband, Damian Blackwood, was a billionaire, powerful, ruthless, and utterly indifferent to her existence. Aaliyah had heard the whispers about him. He was known for his brilliance in business, but when it came to love, he was as cold as ice. Women adored him, but he never let anyone close. And now she was to be his wife, a stranger in his life, bound to him by nothing but duty. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and her mother stepped in, eyes filled with unspoken emotions. "Aaliyah, sweetheart, it's time," she said softly. Aaliyah's heart pounded. Time. The word felt like a sentence, a finality she wasn't ready for, but she had no choice. Her parents had made the decision for her, believing they were securing her future. With trembling fingers, she adjusted her veil and stood up. The fabric of her gown trailed behind her as she walked toward the grand hall, where hundreds of guests awaited. As she stepped in, gasps of admiration filled the air, but she barely heard them. Then she saw him. Damien stood at the altar, tall and commanding in his perfectly tailored black suit. His presence was overwhelming, his sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes making him look like a man carved from stone. But there was no warmth in his gaze. He looked at her like she was just another task on his agenda, an obligation to fulfill. Aaliyah's heart sank. Even now, he didn't seem to care. As she reached the altar, her father placed her hand in Damien's, and a shiver ran down her spine at the coldness of his touch. He neither squeezed her hand nor acknowledged her presence. It was as if she didn't exist. The priest's voice echoed through the hall, but Aaliyah barely registered the words. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching her own life unfold from a distance. When it was time to say the vows, she hesitated. Could she really do this? Her eyes darted toward her parents, who smiled encouragingly. To them, this was a dream come true. They believed they were giving her the best life possible, but they didn't see what she saw. The emptiness in Damien's eyes, the weight of a loveless marriage pressing down on her chest. "Do you, Aaliyah, take Damien Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The words hung in the air, suffocating her. She stole one last glance at Damien, hoping, praying for a sign that this wasn't a mistake. But he simply stared ahead, expression unreadable. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she forced the words out. "I do." A flicker of something passed through Damien's eyes, but it was gone before she could decipher it. The ceremony continued, and soon they were announced as husband and wife. The applause thundered in her ears, but it felt hollow. Damien leaned in, his lips barely brushing against hers in the coldest kiss imaginable. It was a mere formality, nothing more. Aaliyah's stomach twisted. This wasn't how a wedding was supposed to feel. The reception was a grand affair, with expensive champagne flowing and music filling the hall. Damien played the part of a perfect gentleman in front of the guests, his arm around her waist, his smile charming. But it was all an illusion. She felt like a doll, decorated, displayed, but empty inside. "Smile," Damien whispered in her ear as they greeted the guests. "People are watching." His voice was devoid of emotion, and it sent a chill down her spine. As the night wore on, exhaustion seeped into her bones. But it wasn't just physical tiredness, it was emotional, an ache that settled deep within her soul. Finally, they left for Damien's mansion, a place she had never seen before. The car ride was silent, the air thick with unspoken words. Aaliyah wanted to ask him why. Why had he agreed to this marriage if he had no intention of caring for her? But the fear of his answer kept her quiet. When they arrived, she was in awe of the massive estate. The towering mansion was elegant yet cold, much like the man who owned it. As they stepped inside, Damien walked ahead, not once looking back at her. Servants bowed as he passed, and she realized just how vast the gap between their worlds was. Her fingers curled around the fabric of her gown as she followed him into their bedroom. It was grand, luxurious, but it didn't feel like home. Damien turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to worry. I won't force you into anything." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" He sighed, loosening his tie. "This marriage is a formality. I did what was expected of me, and you did what was expected of you. But don't expect anything more from me." His words were like a dagger to her chest. "So, that's it?" she whispered, voice trembling. "I'm just your wife on paper?" He nodded. "You're free to do as you please. I won't interfere in your life, and I expect the same from you." Tears burned her eyes. "Then why did you marry me?" He hesitated, then said coldly, "Because it was necessary." Aaliyah felt like the floor had been ripped from beneath her. He didn't even try to soften the blow. There was no kindness, no consideration, just the cruel truth. Her vision blurred as she turned away. This wasn't what she had dreamed of. She had imagined her wedding night to be filled with love and passion, whispered confessions in the dark, and soft kisses that made her heart race. But instead she was standing in a cold, unfamiliar room with a man who didn't want her. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she sat on the edge of the bed, her wedding dress still on. She had never felt so alone. Behind her, Damien took a blanket and lay down on the couch, not sparing her another glance. Aaliyah curled up, hugging herself. The walls of the mansion felt suffocating, trapping her in a fate she had never wanted. Her heart ached in ways she never thought possible. She had just married a man who would never love her, and that realization shattered her completely. Pseudo 352, March 6th, 2025. Amin Jazz Old. The days after the wedding felt like an endless stretch of emptiness. The grand Blackwood mansion, with its towering ceilings and gleaming marble floors, should have been a place of luxury and comfort. Instead, for Aaliyah, it was nothing more than a golden cage, a prison that reminded her every moment of how alone she truly was. Damien barely spoke to her. Their interactions were brief, almost mechanical, and devoid of warmth. He treated her with polite indifference, acknowledging her presence only when necessary. At the breakfast table, he would sit across from her, reading the business section of the newspaper while sipping his coffee, completely uninterested in any conversation. "Good morning," Aaliyah had tried one day, offering a small smile, desperate for some kind of connection. Damien barely glanced up. "Morning," he muttered before returning to his paper. That was the extent of their exchanges. No affectionate gestures, no shared laughter, nothing but silence stretching between them like an unbridgeable chasm. She tried to understand him, to see beyond his cold exterior. Maybe he just needed time to adjust. Maybe, deep down, he wasn't as distant as he appeared. But as the days turned into weeks, hope began to wither inside her like a dying flower. She wandered the vast halls of the mansion, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The house staff were kind, their eyes filled with sympathy whenever they saw her alone. Margaret, the elderly housekeeper, often brought her tea in the afternoons. "You remind me of a young bride I once knew," Margaret said softly, placing the cup in front of Aliyah. Aliyah looked up. Was she lonely too? Margaret hesitated before nodding. "Loneliness has a way of creeping into a loveless marriage, dear." The words stung more than they should have. Every evening Aliyah waited for Damien, hoping he would come home early, but he never did. She would sit on the plush couch in the living room, staring at the clock as the hours passed. The mansion felt too big, too quiet without him. Sometimes she would hear the distant sound of his car pulling into the driveway late at night. Her heart would leap with anticipation, but it was always short-lived. He never came to their bedroom. One night she waited longer than usual. Midnight came and went, but there was no sign of him. She finally gathered the courage to ask Margaret about Damien's whereabouts. "He often works late, ma'am," the housekeeper said gently, though there was something guarded in her expression. Aliyah wasn't naive. She had seen the gossip columns. Women adored Damien Blackwood. He was wealthy, powerful, and dangerously handsome. She couldn't ignore the possibility that he wasn't just working late. He could be spending his nights elsewhere. Her heart clenched at the thought. But still she tried. She tried to be the perfect wife, preparing dinners for him, dressing beautifully in hopes he would notice her, leaving little gestures to show she cared. She even mustered the courage to sit beside him at dinner one evening. "I thought we could have dinner together tonight," she said softly. Damien barely looked up from his plate. "I already ate at the office." Her hands clenched under the table. Another failed attempt. Another night alone. The loneliness gnawed at her, threatening to consume her. She had never felt so unwanted, so invisible in her own marriage. One night, as she lay awake in the large, empty bed, she made a decision. She couldn't continue living like this, trapped in silence, aching for affection that would never come. She needed to know the truth. The next morning, she waited for Damien in the study. When he finally walked in, looking exhausted but as composed as ever, she forced herself to speak. "Damien," she said, voice steady despite the turmoil inside her, "why do you avoid me?" He paused, clearly not expecting the question. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I mean," she said, stepping closer. "You treat me like a stranger. You never come home on time, and even when you do, it's like I don't exist. I've tried, Damien. I've tried to be a good wife, but you don't even give me a chance." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Aliyah, I thought we were clear from the start. This marriage is nothing more than a contract, a business arrangement." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "But we're married, Damien. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" His gaze hardened. "No." The word cut through her like a blade. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "So that's it. You're just going to keep pretending I don't exist." Damien sighed. "I don't want to hurt you, Aliyah, but I can't give you what you're looking for." Her voice trembled. "And what am I looking for?" "Love," he said simply. "And love has no place in our marriage." The room spun around her. She had hoped, prayed, that maybe, just maybe, she could change things. That if she showed him kindness, if she gave him time, he would open up to her. But he had just shattered every last hope she had clung to. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "Then why did you marry me?" Damien hesitated, his expression unreadable. "Because it was necessary." The words felt hauntingly familiar, just like on their wedding night. She turned away, not wanting him to see her break. "I understand," she whispered. But the truth was, she didn't understand at all. All she knew was that she was married to a man who would never love her, and that realization broke her more than anything else ever could. The night was colder than usual, a silent wind whispering through the vast corridors of the Blackwood mansion. Aaliyah couldn't sleep. How could she, when loneliness wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket? The emptiness of her marriage weighed heavily on her heart, leaving her restless and longing for answers. She wandered through the dimly lit hallways, her bare feet making no sound against the polished marble floors. The mansion, despite its grandeur, felt hollow. It was nothing more than a house filled with expensive things, but devoid of love, of warmth, of anything real. As she passed Damien's study, she heard his deep voice. She stopped, her heart hammering in her chest. He was on the phone. Curiosity kept her rooted in place. Damien rarely spoke to her, barely acknowledged her existence. Who was he talking to so late at night? Then she heard it. "I miss you, baby. I wish I was there with you right now." The words felt like a dagger to her chest. Aaliyah pressed her hand against the cold wall, her breathing shallow. Had she misheard him? "I hate coming home to this empty marriage," Damien continued, his tone softer, filled with an affection she had never heard from him before. "You're the only one who matters to me. This arrangement means nothing." The room spun around her. He already had someone else. Tears stung her eyes as she clutched the fabric of her nightgown. How foolish she had been, clinging to even the smallest hope that one day he would notice her. That maybe, if she tried hard enough, he would see her as more than just a woman forced into his life. But she was nothing to him. Just a name on a marriage certificate, a burden, a wife in title only. The moment he ended the call, she stormed into the room, unable to hold back her pain any longer. "Who was that?" she demanded, her voice trembling with emotion. Damien turned around, startled for a brief moment, but his face quickly hardened. "What are you doing here?" Aaliyah swallowed the lump in her throat. "Who were you talking to?" He exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "That's none of your concern." Her chest tightened. "None of my concern," she repeated, her voice breaking. "I'm your wife, Damien." He let out a hollow laugh, his cold blue eyes meeting hers. "Are you? Because as far as I'm concerned, this marriage is just a formality, a business deal. Nothing more." The words cut deeper than she expected. She took a shaky step forward. "So, you're in love with someone else?" He didn't even hesitate. "Yes." Her heart shattered into pieces. She had feared this, had suspected it, but hearing him say it so bluntly made it unbearable. She felt dizzy, her hands trembling. "Then why did you marry me?" Damien's jaw tightened. "Because I had to." "Had to," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You had a choice, Damien. You could have said no. You could have—" "I didn't have a choice," he snapped, his voice finally breaking with frustration. Aaliyah flinched at the sudden outburst. For the first time, she saw something flicker in his gaze, anger, regret, something deeper. But it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by his usual indifference. "I was expected to marry you," he continued, his tone cold once more. "And I did. But that doesn't mean I have to love you." Tears streamed down her cheeks. She wanted to scream, to demand why he was doing this to her, why he had agreed to this marriage if his heart already belonged to someone else. But no words came out. The silence stretched between them, thick with pain and unspoken words. Finally, she whispered, "You could have just told me the truth." Damien exhaled sharply. "And what difference would it have made? You would still be here, still clinging to some foolish idea that this marriage could ever be real." She shook her head. "I don't—" "Yes, you do," he cut her off. "I see it in your eyes. You still hope, don't you? You still believe that one day I'll wake up and love you." Aaliyah looked away, unable to deny it. Damien sighed, rubbing his temple. Let me make this clear one last time. I will never love you, Aaliyah. Whatever you're hoping for, it's never going to happen. The finality of his words crushed her. She turned away, not wanting him to see the depth of her pain. Then why don't you just leave me? She whispered. Why not set me free? Silence. For a moment, she thought he might actually answer. But then he simply walked past her, his presence as cold as ever. I'll be staying at my penthouse for the next few days, he said without looking back. Don't wait up for me. And just like that, he was gone. Aaliyah stood frozen in the dimly lit study, her heart aching in a way she had never known before. She had entered this marriage hoping for love, but now she realized she had only signed up for heartbreak. The grand hall shimmered under golden chandeliers, the clinking of crystal glasses and soft laughter filling the space. The annual Blackwood Enterprises Gala was one of the most prestigious business events of the year, where the elite gathered, dressed in their finest attire, exchanging pleasantries and sealing million-dollar deals over glasses of champagne. Aaliyah stood at the edge of the room, her fingers nervously clutching the fabric of her elegant, midnight blue gown. She had spent hours getting ready, hoping that tonight might be different, that maybe, just maybe, Damien would acknowledge her in public, even if only as his wife in name. But as usual, he had left her alone the moment they arrived, disappearing into the crowd of powerful businessmen and socialites. Her heart ached, but she had grown used to it. She moved toward the buffet table, forcing a smile as she exchanged polite greetings with unfamiliar faces. But then, her body froze, her heart skipping a painful beat. Across the room, standing beside Damien, was a woman unlike any Aaliyah had ever seen, Sienna Monroe. Tall, stunning, and exuding confidence, Sienna was a vision in a scarlet silk gown that hugged her curves perfectly. Her golden blonde hair cascaded down her back in effortless waves, and her red lips curved into a knowing smirk as she whispered something in Damien's ear. Aaliyah clenched her fingers. She didn't need an introduction. She knew exactly who this woman was. The woman Damien loved. The woman he had confessed his feelings to on that heartbreaking phone call. The woman who had everything Aaliyah had ever wished for. As if sensing her gaze, Sienna turned, her sharp blue eyes locking onto Aaliyah's. For a brief moment, an unreadable expression crossed her face, but then she sauntered forward, heels clicking against the marble floor. Mrs. Blackwood, she drawled, her voice silky and laced with amusement. We finally meet. Aaliyah swallowed hard. Ms. Monroe, she acknowledged, trying to keep her voice steady. Sienna tilted her head, looking her up and down with a smirk. You're even more delicate than I imagined. No wonder Damien prefers me. The words struck like a slap, but Aaliyah refused to let her pain show. If you know he's married, why are you still with him? Sienna laughed, twirling the stem of her wineglass between her fingers. Because, darling, love isn't about a ring or a legal document. It's about passion, chemistry, things you obviously know nothing about. Aaliyah felt the heat of humiliation creep up her neck. That doesn't change the fact that I'm his wife. Sienna raised a brow, her smirk widening. Are you, though? Because from where I'm standing, you're just the woman society forced on him. He doesn't love you, Aaliyah. He never will. A lump formed in Aaliyah's throat, but she refused to let Sienna see her break. I may not have his love, she whispered, but at least I have dignity. Can you say the same? For the first time, Sienna's smirk faltered, but it lasted only a second before she chuckled, shaking her head. Oh, sweetheart, she cooed, patting Aaliyah's cheek mockingly. You're adorable, but let's be honest, you're just a temporary inconvenience. One day, Damien will finally get rid of you, and when that day comes, I'll be the one standing by his side. Aaliyah didn't respond. She couldn't. Her heart ached, her vision blurred with unshed tears. But she wouldn't cry, not here, not in front of Sienna. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she turned on her heel and walked away, ignoring the laughter behind her. She searched for Damien, hoping, praying, that he had at least witnessed what had just happened, that maybe, for once, he would stand up for her. But she found him at the bar, his hand resting intimately on Sienna's waist as they laughed over drinks. Her stomach twisted painfully. She had never truly belonged in his world. That night, Aaliyah lay in bed, curled into herself, silent tears soaking her pillow. The events of the gala replayed in her mind, Sienna's cruel words echoing over and over. "He doesn't love you. He never will. You're just a temporary inconvenience." She clutched the sheets tightly, trying to silence the ache in her heart. But the pain was unbearable. What had she done to deserve this? Why had fate been so cruel to her? Her parents had always told her marriage was sacred, that love would eventually grow. But her marriage wasn't a love story. It was a nightmare, a trap with no escape. Meanwhile, Damien was nowhere to be found. She knew where he was, and with whom. Her chest tightened, the agony of betrayal piercing her like 1,000 knives. The man who was supposed to be her husband was in another woman's arms tonight. And the worst part, he didn't even care. Aaliyah sat by the window, staring at the vast estate that now felt more like a golden prison. The morning sun bathed the garden in a soft glow, birds chirping in the distance, but the warmth of the day could not melt the cold that had settled inside her heart. For weeks she had suffered in silence, drowning in the pain of rejection and betrayal. But as she wiped the last of her tears, she made a silent vow. She would no longer let her happiness depend on a man who didn't see her worth. If Damien Blackwood didn't love her, she would learn to love herself. That afternoon, Aaliyah visited a local charity organization she had read about in the newspaper. It was a small center that provided shelter, food, and education for underprivileged children. The moment she stepped inside, she was greeted with bright, innocent smiles and tiny hands reaching out to her. Her heart softened at the sight of them, children who had nothing, yet their eyes held a kind of happiness she had long forgotten. Aaliyah knelt to speak to a little girl with curly black hair and round brown eyes. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Lena," the girl said shyly. "Well, Lena, I think your dress is very pretty," Aaliyah complimented with a warm smile. Lena giggled, covering her face with her small hands. "Thank you, miss." The interaction melted something inside Aaliyah. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than pain, peace. Days turned into weeks, and the charity became her escape. She dedicated her time to the children, teaching them, playing with them, helping the staff with daily tasks. Their laughter became the melody that drowned out the painful silence of her marriage, and for the first time, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Back at the mansion, Damien began to notice the change in his wife. She no longer waited for him late into the night. She no longer begged for his attention or sought his approval. Instead, she carried a quiet confidence, her face glowing with a happiness he had never seen before. One evening, as he walked through the house, he overheard the staff talking about her. "Mrs. Blackwood has such a kind heart," one of the maids said. "She spends her days at the charity, helping those children like they're her own." "I heard she even used her own money to buy books and supplies for them," another added. Damien frowned, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. Aaliyah was no longer the fragile girl who had been forced into his life. She had changed, and for the first time he found himself intrigued. One evening, Aaliyah returned home later than usual. As she stepped inside the mansion, she was surprised to find Damien waiting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "You're late," he remarked, his voice neutral. She paused, unsure how to respond. "I was at the charity," she said simply. "You spend a lot of time there." Aaliyah nodded. It makes me happy. Damien studied her, his blue eyes scanning her face as if trying to understand her. There was something different about her now. She wasn't the timid bride he had dismissed on their wedding night. She had found her own happiness without him, and for some reason that realization unsettled him. That night, as Aaliyah lay in bed, she thought about Damien's unexpected interest in her. Was it curiosity, or was he finally beginning to see her for who she really was? She didn't know, but for the first time there was a tiny flicker of hope in her heart, a hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The rain poured relentlessly against the windows of the luxurious resort, casting a rhythmic melody across the silent room. Aaliyah sat by the fireplace, staring at the flickering flames, lost in thought. She never expected to be stranded in a tropical paradise with Damien, not that it made a difference. They had been married for months, yet he remained a stranger to her heart. A sudden business trip had brought them here, but an unexpected storm had grounded all flights, forcing them to stay longer than planned. For the first time since their wedding, they had no choice but to spend time together. But what did that mean when he still barely looked at her? The resort was breathtaking, perched on a private island, surrounded by turquoise waters and lush greenery. Aaliyah spent her days walking along the beach, feeling the warm sand beneath her feet, trying to lose herself in the beauty of nature. But today the storm had stolen the sun, replacing it with dark, rolling clouds and the scent of rain in the air. She sighed, hugging herself as she stood on the open terrace. The wind carried the fresh scent of the ocean, and she closed her eyes, allowing the cool droplets to kiss her skin. For the first time in a long while, she felt free. Free from expectations, free from loneliness, free from the pain of loving a man who refused to love her back. She didn't notice Damien watching her from a distance. Inside the resort lounge, Damien sat with a whiskey glass in hand, pretending to listen to his business partners discuss investment strategies. But his attention was elsewhere, drawn to the woman standing alone in the rain. Aaliyah. She was different here. Not the quiet, defeated woman he had married, but someone who carried a quiet strength, someone who wasn't waiting for him anymore. His eyes lingered on her, watching the way the wind played with her dark curls, the way she tilted her head back slightly, letting the rain wash over her face. There was something oddly beautiful about the moment. He frowned, setting his drink down. He shouldn't care, but for some reason he did. Before he realized it, his feet carried him outside. Aaliyah gasped softly as something warm and heavy draped over her shoulders. She turned, startled, and found herself staring into Damien's striking blue eyes. He had placed his jacket around her. "You'll catch a cold," he said simply, his voice softer than she had ever heard before. Aaliyah's lips parted, her heart pounding. She searched his face, trying to understand what had changed. Why was he suddenly looking at her like this? Like she wasn't invisible anymore? Their eyes held for a moment, an unspoken conversation passing between them. And for the first time since their wedding, Damien wasn't cold. He wasn't distant. He was just a man standing in the rain with his wife. And for a fleeting second she let herself wonder, what if? That night they shared dinner together, something they had never done alone before. The resort's dining hall was nearly empty due to the storm, leaving only the two of them in the candlelit space. Aaliyah hesitated before taking a bite of her food. She could feel Damien's eyes on her. "You like working at the charity," he finally said. She looked up, surprised that he had noticed. "Yes, it makes me feel alive." Damien nodded thoughtfully, swirling the wine in his glass. "I never thought you'd be the kind of woman who enjoys helping strangers." Aaliyah frowned slightly. "You never took the time to know me, Damien." Silence fell between them. For once he had no cold, dismissive words. Instead, he studied her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. And she realized something. For the first time, he was trying. Later that night, Aliyah stood by the bedroom window, staring at the storm outside. The rain had softened into a gentle drizzle, the wind no longer howling. A knock on the door startled her. She turned, expecting a servant, but instead she found Damien standing there. "I wanted to say good night," he said, his voice low. She swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He had never said good night before, never acknowledged her presence unless it was necessary. Yet here he was. A small, fragile hope bloomed in her heart, but she quickly crushed it, reminding herself that Damien Blackwood was not a man who loved. She would not let herself fall for him. Not again. Sienna Monroe had always been confident in her place in Damien Blackwood's life. She was the woman he loved, the one he had chosen before and after his marriage to Aliyah. To her, Aliyah was nothing more than a powerless, insignificant girl forced into Damien's life through an arrangement. But now, something had changed. Damien was looking at Aliyah differently. Sienna's blood boiled as she recalled how Damien had wrapped his jacket around his wife at the resort, how he had stood close to her in the rain, speaking to her in a voice that wasn't cold or dismissive. For the first time, there was something unsettling in his gaze when he looked at Aliyah, and Sienna couldn't let that happen. Later that evening, she stormed into Damien's penthouse, where he was seated in his study, sipping a glass of whiskey. "What's going on, Damien?" she demanded, her tone sharper than usual. He didn't even look up. "Be more specific, Sienna." She marched toward him, slamming her clutch onto the desk. "Don't play games with me. You've been acting different ever since that trip with Aliyah. Tell me it doesn't mean anything." Damien sighed, finally meeting her gaze. "It doesn't." Sienna studied him, searching for the absolute certainty he used to have when speaking about Aliyah. But there was something different this time, a pause, a hesitation. It was brief, but she saw it. It was enough to send a chill down her spine. She refused to let him slip away. Not because she was madly in love with him. No, Sienna Monroe loved power. She loved the status, the privilege, and the unwavering attention that came with being the woman of Damien Blackwood. And she wouldn't let Aliyah steal that from her. She needed to make Aliyah leave Damien's life forever. But how? As she paced across the room, an idea formed, a wicked, perfect plan that would humiliate Aliyah so badly she wouldn't dare to show her face in Damien's world again. Sienna smirked to herself. If Aliyah thought she had a chance, she was about to learn otherwise. Meanwhile, Aliyah sat in her room, torn between anger and an emotion she hated admitting. Hope. Damien had been kinder to her these past few days, but did that mean anything? Was she foolish to feel anything at all for a man who had ignored her for so long? She clenched her fists, trying to silence her heart. Number. She refused to be that naive girl again, but deep down she knew the truth. No matter how much pain Damien had caused her, a part of her still wanted him. The Blackwood mansion was alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. The grand party was a spectacle. Business elites, celebrities, and high society guests filled the ballroom, their conversations dripping with wealth and power. Aliyah stood at the edge of the room, dressed in a stunning midnight blue gown. Despite the elegance of her attire, she felt invisible. She had always felt like an outsider in Damien's world, but tonight something felt different, like an ominous storm was brewing. And then it happened. Sienna Monroe, breathtaking in a scarlet dress that commanded attention, stepped onto the center stage. A sly smile played on her lips as she tapped her champagne glass with a spoon, silencing the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she purred, her voice laced with mischief. "Tonight, we celebrate power, success, and, of course, love." Her eyes flickered toward Damien, who stood near the bar, watching with mild disinterest. "But there's something else I think we should celebrate, something truly rare in our modern world." She let the suspense build before turning to Aliyah with mock admiration. Innocence. Aliyah's heart skipped a beat. A chill ran down her spine as every pair of eyes in the room turned to her. Sienna smirked. Many of you may not know this, but our dear Aliyah is untouched, a pure, devoted wife, waiting for a love that will never come. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Whispers began. Laughter followed. Aliyah's breath hitched. The weight of humiliation crashed over her like a tidal wave. She glanced at Damien, silently begging for him to put an end to this, to say something, anything, to stop the humiliation. But he did nothing. He just stood there, silent, cold, unmoved. Sienna continued, her voice dripping with mockery. Imagine being married to the most desirable man in the country, yet still untouched, unwanted. She feigned pity. Poor thing, still a virgin in a marriage where her husband loves another woman? The whispers grew louder, laughter sharper. Aliyah clenched her fists, forcing back the tears that threatened to spill. She had endured many things in this marriage, loneliness, neglect, heartbreak. But this public humiliation was unbearable. Her vision blurred, her body trembled, and still Damien said nothing. The party continued around her as if nothing had happened, but for Aliyah the world had stopped, shattered, humiliated. She turned on her heels and walked away. Not a single person stopped her, not even Damien. That night she locked herself in her room. The tears she had held back now streamed down her face, soaking the pillows as she lay curled on the bed. She had tried, she had endured, she had hoped. But for what? For a man who refused to acknowledge her pain? For a love that would never exist? A sob racked her body. She clutched her chest as if she could physically hold herself together. She couldn't live like this anymore. She wouldn't. Something inside her had broken tonight. And once something was broken, it could never be the same again. The early morning light filtered through the curtains as Aliyah sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the empty suitcase before her. Her hands trembled as she neatly folded the last of her clothes, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had made her decision. She was leaving. It wasn't easy. Every part of her still ached for Damien's love, still craved the warmth she had never received from him. But after last night, after the humiliation, after his silence, she knew there was nothing left to fight for. She had loved him. God, how she had loved him. But love was not meant to be begged for. Aliyah picked up a pen and a piece of paper. With tears in her eyes, she began writing the hardest letter of her life. Damien, I never imagined I would have to write this. I wanted to be your wife in every way that mattered, not just by name. I wanted to make you happy, to be someone you could turn to. But I was foolish. I waited for you. Every night I hoped you would see me, that one day you would let me in. But all I ever received was your cold indifference. I don't blame you for not loving me, Damien. But I can't keep living this way. I can't keep hoping for something that will never come. I loved you with everything I had, but love isn't supposed to be this painful. I'm leaving, not because I want to, but because I have no choice. I won't beg to be loved. Goodbye, Aliyah. Her hands shook as she folded the letter, placing it carefully on the nightstand. Taking one last glance at the room that had been more of a prison than a home, she lifted her suitcase and stepped out. No one stopped her. The house staff looked at her with pity, but they understood. They had seen the way she suffered. By the time Damien returned that evening, the house was silent. Damien walked into the bedroom, tossing his suit jacket onto the chair. He loosened his tie, heading toward the bed when his eyes fell on something, a piece of paper. Frowning, he picked it up, and as he read the words, a strange tightness gripped his chest. Aliyah was gone. He blinked, rereading the letter, expecting to feel, what? Relief? Indifference? But what he felt instead was an unfamiliar hollowness, a discomfort he couldn't name. He dropped the letter, his hands clenching into fists. She had really left. She wasn't just in another room, waiting for him. She wasn't going to look at him with those soft eyes anymore, wasn't going to sit quietly at the dinner table, hoping for his attention. For the first time in his life, Damien Blackwood felt something foreign and deeply unsettling. An ache, a loss, and worst of all, regret. Damien Blackwood had always been a man of control. His life was ruled by logic, not emotions. Work, power, and success had always been his priorities, and he never allowed anything, or anyone, to disrupt his carefully structured world. But now, for the first time, he was unraveling. Aaliyah was gone, and he couldn't escape the suffocating emptiness that followed. At first, he told himself it was nothing, that her absence didn't matter, that he would carry on as always, unaffected. But as the days passed, something gnawed at him. The mansion felt colder, quieter, lonelier. He would walk into a room expecting to see her small frame curled on the couch, reading a book or standing by the window, lost in thought. But she wasn't there. Her soft laughter, which he had ignored so often, now echoed in his mind like a haunting melody. He found himself remembering the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the way she bit her lip when she was deep in thought, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about the things she loved. She had always been there, waiting for him, loving him, and he had let her go. One evening, as he sat in his office, drowning in paperwork, his eyes drifted to the clock. It was late, past midnight. A strange sensation settled in his chest. She would still be awake at this hour. She used to sit in the library, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes glued to a novel. Sometimes she would fall asleep there, curled up in the oversized chair, looking so fragile and peaceful. And every night, when he came home late, he would find her like that. He had never spoken to her, never woken her up. But he had always watched her for a moment longer than necessary before walking away. Why did I always walk away? The thought struck him like a punch to the gut. He had convinced himself that she was just another obligation, that her presence didn't affect him. But now, stripped of her quiet patience, her unwavering love, he realized how much he had taken for granted, how much he had lost. The next morning, he made his decision. He needed to find her. Damien had access to the best resources. He could find anyone, anywhere. Yet, when he called his assistant to begin the search, he was met with unexpected news. "She's gone, sir," his investigator informed him. "She didn't just leave your home. She left the city." Damien's grip on the phone tightened. Where did she go? There's no trace of her. She didn't use her credit cards, didn't check into any hotels. It's like she disappeared. His jaw clenched, vanished. For the first time in his life, Damien Blackwood felt something close to panic. He had spent years ignoring her. Now, when he finally realized how much she mattered, she had slipped through his fingers like sand. And for the first time, Damien truly understood what regret felt like. The crisp morning air filled Aaliyah's lungs as she stepped onto the bustling streets of a new city. A city that didn't know her pain, her past, or the wounds she carried in her heart. For the first time in months, she felt free. Not from marriage, but from the weight of waiting for a love that had never come. She had left behind everything. Her loveless marriage, the mansion that felt more like a prison, and the man who had never wanted her. And though her heart still carried scars, she was determined to heal. Aaliyah threw herself into her charity work, finding solace in helping those who truly needed love and care. At the community shelter, she worked with children who had no one to look after them. Their innocent smiles, their warm hugs, and their unspoken trust slowly mended the broken pieces of her heart. "You have a kind heart, Miss Aaliyah," an elderly woman at the shelter told her one day. "Someone must have hurt you deeply for you to pour so much love into these children." Aaliyah only smiled. She had once begged for love. Now she had found it, not in a man's cold heart, but in the laughter of children, in the grateful eyes of the homeless, in the warmth of the community she had built around her. She had rebuilt herself. She no longer waited for Damien. But miles away, in a city where his name carried power, Damien Blackwood was a man undone. The silence in his mansion was unbearable. He had never realized how much life Aaliyah had brought into it. Now every room felt empty, every night stretched unbearably long. He found himself thinking about her at the most unexpected moments. During meetings, he would catch himself staring at his phone, wondering if she would ever call. At night, he would lie awake, remembering the way she had looked at him with those soft brown eyes, eyes filled with love he had never deserved. Her absence was a slow torture. And then, one evening, as he sat alone in his office, a terrifying realization hit him. He loved her. He had always loved her. He had just been too blind to see it. But now, was it too late? Damien Blackwood had spent weeks searching for Aaliyah, following every lead, chasing every whisper of her presence. And then, one evening, his search finally ended. Under the golden glow of sunset, he stood at the edge of a charity event, his heart pounding as he spotted her in the crowd. Aaliyah. She was different. She wasn't the fragile woman he had left behind. She wasn't the lonely bride waiting for his affection. She was radiant, standing among children, her laughter blending with theirs, her eyes filled with a peace he had never seen before. For a moment he hesitated. Would she even want to see him? Would she hate him? Would she look at him with the same love she once did? Or had he destroyed that forever? Taking a deep breath, Damien pushed forward. Aaliyah was placing a blanket around a little girl when she felt a familiar presence behind her. The air around her changed, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. She turned slowly, her breath hitched. Damien. She had imagined this moment so many times. She had wondered how she would feel if she ever saw him again. Would she break down? Would she scream at him for the pain he had caused? But instead, she felt nothing, just a quiet ache. Can we talk? Damien's voice was hoarse, his eyes pleading. Aaliyah exhaled sharply. I don't think we have anything left to say, Damien. Please, he whispered. Just 5 minutes. Something in his tone made her pause. She nodded once, leading him away from the crowd. I was a fool, Damien started, his hands trembling. I had everything, and I let it go. I hurt you, Aaliyah. I see that now, and he swallowed hard. I love you. Aaliyah's chest tightened. How many nights had she dreamed of hearing those words? How many times had she begged for this moment? But now that it was here, she felt nothing but exhaustion. Love, she repeated, her voice calm but firm. Damien, love isn't about words. It's about actions. He stared at her, desperate, vulnerable. Tell me what to do. I'll do anything to prove it. Aaliyah looked at him for a long time before whispering, Then prove it, Damien. And with that she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his heart pounding with the weight of her challenge. Damien Blackwood had always believed that power and wealth could solve anything. But standing in the middle of a small, worn-down orphanage, surrounded by children who barely had enough to eat, he realized how little those things truly mattered, and how much Aaliyah had been right all along. For weeks now, he had dedicated himself to a single mission, winning back the woman he had pushed away. Not through grand gestures, not through expensive gifts, but through something far more difficult for him, patience, effort, and sincerity. He knew Aaliyah was watching him closely, studying him, testing him, and for once he didn't mind, because this time he wouldn't run away. Aaliyah stood by the window of the orphanage, her arms crossed, watching Damien struggle to fix a broken chair. His tailored suit jacket was discarded, his crisp white shirt now covered in dirt and paint. She had never seen him like this before, so unpolished, so real. He wasn't giving orders. He wasn't controlling the room like he did in his board meetings. He was just a man, one who had everything but was now willing to start from nothing, just to earn her trust. But could she trust him? Could she forget the nights she cried alone while he was with another woman? Could she erase the humiliation, the betrayal, the pain? She wanted to believe he had changed, but belief didn't come easily when the scars ran so deep. So she kept her distance, allowing him to prove himself. "Mr. Damien, can you push me?" a little girl asked, tugging on his sleeve as she sat on the rusted swings in the orphanage's playground. Damien hesitated. He had never been around children like this before. He was used to boardrooms, deals, negotiations, not tiny hands and innocent eyes looking up at him with trust. But this was Aaliyah's world, and if he wanted to be a part of it, he had to learn. "Of course," he said finally, moving behind the girl. He pushed her gently at first, afraid she might fall. "No, higher," she squealed, laughing. Aaliyah, who had been watching from afar, found herself smiling despite herself. Damien was trying. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't suddenly a different man overnight. But he was putting in the effort. And that mattered. A week passed, then two. Damien kept coming back. At first, the children were wary of him. To them, he was just another rich man, someone who didn't belong in their world. But slowly, that changed. They laughed when he got paint all over himself during an art class. They cheered when he joined them in a soccer match, despite him being absolutely terrible at it. They pulled him into their games, their stories, their lives. And Damien let them. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the cold, ruthless businessman everyone feared. He felt human. And Aaliyah? She watched it all. She saw the way he no longer looked at his phone every 5 minutes, how he focused entirely on the moment. She saw the way his smiles became more genuine, how he no longer carried that air of arrogance. The man who had once dismissed her, ignored her, belittled her, was disappearing. And in his place, a different Damien was emerging. A moment of weakness. One evening, as Aaliyah was closing up the orphanage, she found Damien sitting on the steps outside. He looked exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. She hesitated before sitting beside him. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know," she said quietly. Damien let out a deep breath. "I know." "Then why?" He turned to her, and for the first time she saw something raw in his eyes. "Because I don't want to be that man anymore," he admitted. "The man who hurt you, the man who was too blind to see what he had until it was gone." Aaliyah's heart clenched. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself feel again. But fear still lingered. She stood up. "Words mean nothing, Damien. If you truly want to change, prove it." And with that, she walked away, leaving him sitting there, his heart heavy with the weight of redemption. But this time he wouldn't give up. A soft breeze carried the scent of fresh roses, and fairy lights twinkled like stars above the orphanage's garden. The place that once symbolized Aaliyah's escape from her loveless marriage had now become the backdrop for a new beginning. She stood beneath the grand oak tree, her heart pounding as she watched Damien kneel before her. But this time he wasn't the cold, untouchable businessman. This time he wasn't offering a deal. This time he was just a man in love. "Aaliyah." His voice was deep but unsteady, a stark contrast to the confident tycoon he once was. She had never seen him like this before, so vulnerable, so open. "I don't deserve you," he admitted. "I know that. I've made mistakes, hurt you in ways I can never take back, but the only thing I know for certain is that my world means nothing without you in it." Aaliyah felt her throat tighten. This was real, not rehearsed, not calculated, just raw, honest love. Damien took a deep breath, his fingers trembling as he pulled a ring from his pocket. I don't want a marriage of convenience. I don't want a contract. I don't want you to be with me because of family obligations. I want you to be with me because you love me, because you choose me. Tears welled in her eyes. I love you, Aaliyah. His voice cracked. And I will spend every day proving that to you if you'll let me. Aaliyah had spent months wondering if this moment would ever come. She had convinced herself that love with Damien was impossible, that she was foolish to ever hope for it. But the man kneeling before her was not the same man she had married. He was different now. He had changed, not because she begged him to, not because of guilt, but because he wanted to be better. For her. And that made all the difference. A single tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered, "Yes." Damien's breath caught. Then, as if afraid she might change her mind, he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands shaking with emotion. The moment it was secure, he stood and pulled her into his arms. She melted into him, finally, completely. This embrace was different. It wasn't filled with uncertainty or forced obligation. It was real, filled with love. Damien cupped her face, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" he whispered. Aaliyah let out a soft laugh through her tears. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." And for the first time she kissed him, not as a duty, not as an obligation, but as a woman truly in love with her husband. The guests, orphans, volunteers, and even some of Damien's closest employees burst into applause. The children ran up, throwing flower petals in the air, giggling with excitement. Damien held Aaliyah close, his lips brushing her forehead. "You've made me the happiest man alive," he murmured. She smiled up at him, love shining in her eyes. "And you've made me believe in love again." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Aaliyah realized something. Love wasn't about how you started. It wasn't about perfection. It was about who proved they were worthy of staying. And Damien had proven himself. Finally. Forever.